All right, everyone, hopefully you can hear me. My name is Tu Clark. I'm with the Office of Environmental Management, and I am the Environmental Permit Specialist. And I also am the Project Delivery Coordinator for District 7. So today I'm going to talk about natural resources and then environmental permitting. And we'll split those two topics kind of in half. First, talking about natural resources, which is inclusive of protected species and habitat, wetlands, and essential fish habitat. So we will go over why these issues must be addressed, how to prepare the technical report, how we use the information to consult with or coordinate with the agencies, and then how we document this information during PD&E. So first, let's talk about, what's included in the natural resources evaluation, protected species and habitat. It is a technical report that's used for consultation or coordination with the resource agencies. The information that we create this technical document as a part of the PD&E, then we take the summary of that information and include it in the environmental document. But let's go over some of those regulations that we need to be mindful as we are preparing the natural resources evaluation and doing the analysis for these three resources. First is the Endangered Species Act. This is federal legislation intended to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered and threatened species depend may be conserved and provide programs for the conservation of those species, thus preventing the extinction of native plants and animals. So if you notice here, I have both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service as the jurisdictional agencies for that, and I'll get into that a little bit more. It's important to remember that we need to do that consultation with both of those agencies, depending on what species are in your particular project. For example, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we're going to coordinate those ESA activities for terrestrial and freshwater species. And for National Marine Fisheries, we are going to be coordinating with them for marine and anadromous species. So we just have to keep in mind, if we're impacting a particular type of species, for ESA, it might be with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and or National Marine Fisheries Service. This is just the list of some of the regulations for federal species, and we won't go through all of them, but the endangered and threatened wildlife and plants are in 50 CFR Part 17. Marine mammals, we need to pay attention to those, migratory birds, and so forth, but this is just some of those regulations that we need to be mindful of. On the state side, we work with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Specifically, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission serves as the state wildlife commenting agency on state environmental permits, and they also issue certain protected species permit. In section 379.2291 of the Florida statutes is the Endangered and Threatened Species Act. It is the policy of this state to conserve and wisely manage these resources with particular attention to those species defined by the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the Department of Environmental Protection, or the United States Department of Interior or successor agencies as being endangered or threatened. So this is just that similar state regulation that is similar to at the federal level. So we have to make sure we are coordinating with FWC if there are state listed species in our project. In addition to the particular rule that I just mentioned, the statute that I just mentioned, there's also the Imperiled Species Management Plan, which was developed in November of 2016, with the effects taking in January of 2017. It includes the listing status changes for 23 species. This plan is designed to conserve 57 fish and wildlife species over the next 10 years, and it combines species action plans addressing individual species needs with integrated conservation strategies benefiting multiple species and shared habitats. I also want to highlight that we also take a look at the state species regulations for plants as well. Section 581.185 is the preservation of native flora in Florida. So it's important if we have protected plants, state plants in our project area, that we coordinate with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services for those projects. So let's transition to wetlands. For wetlands, they are both protected at the federal and state level. I've included here 33 CFR 328. That is the definition of wetlands at the federal level. And then also at the state level, it is defined in 373.019. They're very similar, but it's just to highlight that these resources are important. They're defined at both federal and state levels. Specifically for the protection of wetlands and other surface waters, at the federal level is the Clean Water Act and the Rivers and Harbors Act. The Clean Water Act establishes the basic structure for regulating discharges of pollutants into waters of the U.S. and regulating surface water quality standards. The Army Corps of Engineers administers the 404 permitting and under the Clean Water Act. The Rivers and Harbors Act prohibits the construction of any bridge, dam, dike, or causeway over or in navigable waterways of the U.S. without congressional approval. The U.S. Coast Guard administers the bridge permit program under Section 9 of this act. The Corps also has permitting authority under the Rivers and Harbors Act. I believe it's Section 10. Here are just some of the Army Corps regulations. They're all identified in 33 CFR. You can see their general regulatory policies in Part 320, permitting for structures in 322, permits for discharges of dredged or fill material in 323. And I'll just keep this up here for a little while and you can refer back to it, but this is when it comes to these regulatory authorities, they're in the CFR, and it's important for us to pay attention to those things. The Coast Guard, very similar in 33 CFR, their regulations are broken down. They have those general guidelines, and then they dive down specifically into bridge location and clearances and their administrative procedures. There's even regulations for bridge lighting and other signals. And these are just some, I want to reiterate, these are just some of those Coast Guard regulations. On the state side of things, for the Florida statutes, Chapter 373 talks about water resources. Chapter 403 talks about pollution control. And then further, we go into the Florida Administrative Code 62330 for environmental resource permitting, 62340 for the delineation of wetlands, 62345 for the uniform mitigation assessment method. And then I also tossed in 18-21 of the Florida Administrative Code for sovereignty submerged lands management. But these are just some of the ones that the DEP or the Water Management District have authority over. And I also want to note that as a part of the environmental resource permitting process, there is coordination with the Florida Wildlife Conservation Commission and then even the State Historic Preservation Officer as needed. So let's transition into essential fish habitat. The federal regulatory authority for this resource is the National Marine Fisheries Service. So they wear two different hats. They have the responsibility under ESA, and they also have additional responsibility for essential fish habitat. The National Marine Fisheries identifies and protects important marine and anadromous fish habitat and establishes a means for designating essential fish habitat. And EFH are those waters and substrates necessary to fish for spawning, breeding, feeding, or growth to maturity. EFH includes seagrasses, mangroves. EFH is protected under the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act, and this act mandates that federal agencies consult with National Marine Fisheries regarding actions that may adversely affect EFH. All right, so with that, we talked about protected species and habitat, wetlands, and EFH. And then what we do as part of the PD&E is when we analyze those things, we prepare a natural resources evaluation, which is inclusive of all three of those items. So when is it appropriate to prepare a natural resources evaluation? It is going to be prepared for projects where the impacts to federal listed species and candidate or critical habitat, where consultation is going to be required. It is also going to be prepared where you have impacts to wetlands that require either a standard or individual federal permit or a regional general permit, and the one that we use most often is SAJ 92. I'll talk about that in the permitting section. And then it is also prepared for those projects where we will have substantial adverse effects to central fish habitat. It's also important to note that natural resources evaluations wouldn't necessarily be required for all of our projects. Sometimes it's important, sometimes we can prepare what you call a tech memo, and those tech memos can be prepared for projects where we have minimal impacts, where agency consultation is not required. But we also have to remember where if consultation is not required, that tech memo is not a consultation document. It is not something that we're going to send to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries for consultation. And then I also want to note that when we prepare a tech memo, you can, in certain circumstances, use the programmatic effect determination keys. If that's the case and we get to a point where the effect determination keys result in no effect or may affect not likely to adversely affect, and where use of the keys is appropriate, we can also add that to the tech memo, and it does not need to go to the agency for consultation. I just wanted to highlight some of those programmatic effect determination keys that the department is able to use. As you can see here, we have them for the Eastern Indigo Snake. There's also Florida Panther effect determination key, Manatee key, Wood Stork key, and so forth and so on. But when we use those keys, it's important that we provide the appropriate documentation for those. And this is just an example of the Wood Stork key where the pathway is highlighted, and that is then attached to the appropriate environmental document, or for your case, it might be the state environmental impact report or the non-major state action. If you end up having a project that has that federal nexus where there's federal funding or an FHWA action is required, you would also attach this to the appropriate NEPA document as well. So if you heard a lot of the things that I talked about, I said lots of federal, and I know with turnpike projects, we do a lot of state funding. And it's important to kind of remember the roles that we have. I know Jason talked about NEPA assignment before, and in those scenarios where we have a turnpike project is intersecting or requires an FHWA approval, and you need to prepare a NEPA document, you can actually move forward and be the lead entity. FDOT can be the lead agency and complete ESA consultation. But most often, because turnpike projects are state funded and there is no federal nexus with FHWA, the consultation will have to be done generally as a part of permitting. And then the only avenue that you have with the services would be to ask for technical assistance as part of the PD&E. So just keep those things in mind when, whether you are, the project funding is going to be important to help you decide whether you're going to be pursuing consultation as part of the PD&E, or you're going to be only asking for technical assistance during PD&E. All right, so let's talk about what an NRE looks like. And so a part of and included in the PD&E manual is an NRE outline. We also have a guidance document on how to prepare an NRE. So I'll talk briefly a little bit about what is going to be required. So first, you're going to have an NRE cover page. You're going to need to include an executive summary, which includes a project description that should be brief, and then the results of the evaluation. So whether it be protected species, what did you find there, what your wetland impacts are, what your essential fish habitat impacts are, and then you'll also include a project overview. For the protected and species and habitat section, be sure to include the laws and agencies with jurisdiction, include any prior agency coordination and methodology used to determine involvement with protected species. Be sure to include federal listed species and designated critical habitat. Also discuss state listed species and other protected species, and include any environmental permits that may be required. For the federal listed species and critical habitat, make sure you include a short paragraph for each of those species, including the listing status and a brief background. Discuss documented occurrences and include maps. Discuss survey methodology, include how the evaluation was done. Evaluate how project actions will impact species and habitat. Discuss avoidance minimization and any compensation if required, and then include any best management practices or standard protection measures. And that's species standard protection measures, just to be clear. It's also important to include the appropriate federal species effect determination, which include no effect, may affect not likely to adversely affect, or may affect likely to adversely affect. And then when you have that scenario where you have a may affect likely to adversely affect, that's going to require formal consultation. For state listed species, we generally follow the outline for federal species, but the effect determinations are going to be a little bit different, and we want them to be different so we can clarify what's federally protected and what is state listed as well. And the appropriate effect determinations would be no effect anticipated, no adverse effect anticipated, or potential for adverse effect. And I also want to identify, as you remember, I talked about state listed plants. In the scenario for state listed plants, if they're in your project area, the department notifies the Department of Agriculture and Community, the FDACS, Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, sorry, I just forgot there, and the Endangered Plant Advisory Council when bids for construction projects are first advertised. And this is required under Chapter 5B-40 of the Florida Administrative Code. For the species section, we also talk about other protected species and habitat. So species that are not on a federal or state species list, but are protected by federal or state law. For example, bald eagle is no longer listed, but is protected under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. We also include strategic habitat conservation areas, which are those areas identified FWC that are critical for species recovery and useful for conservation planning. And then we also include the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, rare natural communities, and these should be addressed and issues worked out through coordination with appropriate state resource agencies. Also note that effect determinations are not necessary for these species that are not listed. Earlier, I talked about informal consultation versus formal consultation, and let's talk a little bit about informal consultation first. In this scenario, the district or the turnpike prepares a natural resources evaluation. If we are sending a document to the agency This is for federally funded projects. If we are sending the NRE to the agency for concurrence, OEM will typically review that NRE prior to agency submittal. And then the district submits the OEM reviewed NRE to the services. The service typically responds within 30 days. For turnpike projects, if the project requires an FHWA decision, therefore resulting in a NEPA document, OEM would also review the NRE prior to agency submittal. But for those state-funded projects, we would not review the natural resources evaluation. For formal consultation, this is going to be required if we end up with an effect determination of may affect likely to adversely affect. The district or the turnpike prepares the natural resources evaluation as a biological assessment. OEM also reviews the NRE prior to agency submittal, and then OEM submits the biological assessment, or in DOT language, the NRE, to the services. The services then have up to 135 days to make their final decision, and then the details about what happens within those 135 days are on this slide, and you can read that later. The result of formal consultation can be a biological opinion, which is a non-jeopardy opinion, including an incidental take statement and terms and conditions that are non-discretionary measures, meaning we have to fulfill those items that the service is requiring. Also, we can also end up with a jeopardy or adverse modification opinion, which is very rare, and in those instances, the FDOT has a few options. We can adopt the reasonable and prudent alternatives, or we can choose to not advance the project. We can request an exemption, or we can modify the action to not have those impacts. If we proceed with the action upon review of the biological opinion and FDOT believes that we can also choose to proceed with the action if upon further review of the biological opinion, FDOT believes that such action satisfies Section 7. And of course, that's, like I'd mentioned earlier, this is very rare. In my time at DOT, I don't think I've ever seen a scenario where the service has resulted in a jeopardy opinion. So let's transition to the wetlands and other surface waters section of the NRE. Similar to the protected species section, include laws and agencies with jurisdiction, include any prior agency coordination, those ETAC comments that I think Pete and Ruth talked about earlier, and then also include the methodology for delineation as well. You're going to need to describe and identify the wetlands using flux codes, or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Classification of Wetlands and Deep Water Habitats of the U.S., discuss avoidance and minimization measures, and include the functional assessment of wetlands using Rule 62.345, discuss any compensatory mitigation that may be required, and then mitigation options. Those mitigation options could be the purchase of wetland credits, working with the water management district for mitigation, and also, as a last resort, permittee responsible mitigation, where we identify a project, an area where we build a wetland to offset wetland impacts. Where you have wetland impacts and you have mitigation, be sure to include the mitigation standard statement, which basically says wetland impacts which will result from the consultation of this project will be mitigated pursuant to 3734137 of the Florida statutes to satisfy all mitigation requirements of Part 4 of Chapter 373 and 33 USC Part 1344. It's important to be sure to include that. And then the last part of the natural resources evaluation, at least the resource topics, is essential fish habitat. Similar to those two other options, include the laws and agencies with jurisdiction, any prior agency consultation. Methodology, be sure to identify essential fish habitat, habitat areas of particular concern, and manage species that may be affected. Be sure to provide an analysis of the adverse effects, and then summarize proposed measures to avoid, minimize, or offset adverse impacts. Similar to protected species, we need to be sure to include the effect determinations. For essential fish habitat, the terminology is minimal, more than minimal, but less than substantial, or substantial. In determining these impacts, you're going to be using professional judgment, past experience, similar to the discussion that was described about substantial impacts or significant impacts. So some of those similar guidelines should be used for determining whether EFH impacts are substantial, minimal, or more than minimal but less than substantial. In the scenario where you need to complete consultation with National Marine Fisheries, an EFH assessment is the analysis of a project's potential substantial adverse effects on EFH, and if necessary, measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those effects. An NRE is that document that can be submitted as the EFH assessment to National Marine Fisheries when this consultation is required. The EFH assessment includes the identification of EFH, the HAPCs, and managed species. It also includes proposed measures to avoid, minimize, mitigate, or otherwise offset adverse impacts, and then also those effect determinations regarding EFH. The National Marine Fisheries will provide a response. The National Marine Fisheries will prepare a written project evaluation. It could be a letter, memo, or email with conservation recommendations, which are non-binding. It may also include measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse effects on EFH. FDOT is required to respond within 30 days, explaining how FDOT will proceed. All right, so those are the three big topics, the three sections of the NRE, and now we need to continue on the rest of the outline. Also part of the NRE is the anticipated permits. So this is just where we simply list those anticipated environmental permits, and we'll talk a little bit about permits later on in this session. And then for the NRE, you also need to have a conclusion. You're going to summarize each resource section, list any implementation measures, list any commitments, and describe next steps so the agency can understand how we're going to be moving forward. And I want to spend a little bit of time on implementation measures. Those things, those are actions that FDOT would be required to take for procedure, standard specification, or other agency requirements, and will be implemented at a later project phase. They help address or reduce project effects and need to be included in the NRE and communicated to the agencies. Some things that should be identified as implementation measures are using best management practices for erosion control, conducting gopher tortoise surveys and obtaining relocation permits, conducting bald eagle or osprey nest surveys, updating general wildlife or plant surveys during design phase. So some of those things should be identified as implementations measures, which are not commitments. And commitments are those obligations to an external stakeholder to provide a feature or perform an action related to a project that will be implemented in a future project phase. Some things that are commitments would be agency species standard protection measures, which are very common for us to include as a commitment. Species specific surveys could also be identified as commitments. There is a specific chapter that talks about PD&E commitments, part 2, chapter 22. And then there's also the FDOT project commitment tracking procedure that I'm going to refer you to. And it describes how the department tracks commitments from PD&E all the way through construction. And then what if have a scenario where you need to prepare an NRE addendum. So this is prepared when an agency requests additional information to be able to communicate consultation on a project, or if a project design changes and results in additional impacts that need to be evaluated. In this NRE addendum, it's important to include any agency comments that you've already had, and then provide an explanation of the revision updates to the original natural resources evaluation. So documenting the natural resources evaluation in the SEER, I included SEER mostly for the Turnpike audience today, but similar to kind of what Matt was talking about earlier, we're going to be providing the summary of the analysis in the SEER, include agency coordination or consultation or technical assistance information in the SEER. The NRE itself is not attached to the environmental document, but any agency concurrence letter should be attached to the environmental document. Here are some of the resources that I mentioned throughout this part of the discussion. Part 2, Chapter 16 speaks to protected species and habitat. Part 2, Chapter 9 talks about wetlands and other surface waters. And Part 2, Chapter 17 talks about essential fish habitat. I'll also refer you to the Natural Resources Evaluation Outline and Guidance that's available on OEM's website. And then we recently had an NRE training session that has been recorded, and the link is also provided on this page.